Hey everybody, Chris here. Alan Watts has been generous enough to send us several signed chain reaction 40 years of sport climbing posters that I'm going to be giving away to our patrons, the Secret Stoners Club. You can join the Secret Stoners Club for free and get entered into that drawing at patreon.com/Secret Stoners Club. All right, let's get into it. Season 2 of Written in Stone is generously supported by RAB. Founded in 1981 by climbers, for climbers, RAB are on a journey to reduce the impact of their business, expand access to the outdoors, and preserve our mountain playgrounds for future generations. RAB, the mountains are our meeting place. Our research partner, Knowles, the National Outdoor Leadership School, believes in teaching outdoor skills through intentional experience in the outdoors, exactly how it should be. Knowles, learn by doing. And this episode is brought to you by Tension Climbing, training and performance equipment built with improvement in mind. Use code WRITTEN15 for 15% off of select items. In Rock and Ice magazine number 11, the holiday issue, published in December 1985, Paul Piana is interviewing Todd Skinner and asks him, "Are there any climbers who you feel are making significant contributions to climbing, specifically in the U.S., but generally anywhere else?" Skinner replies, "On my recent travels, I was very impressed with Alan Watts, who is, without reservation, the best climber right now in America." Meanwhile, Alan Watts was preparing for a 3-month trip to Europe to see what climbing looked like over there. He'd been impressed by a few European climbers who'd come through and obliterated the hardest routes in the U.S. and wanted to know the secrets. After his trip, he would write an article titled Eurotrends, published in Climbing Magazine number 100 at the beginning of 1987. It began, "Climbers throughout the United States are beginning to wake up. After years of complacency, a growing number of individuals are working hard to raise stagnant U.S. standards." While in Europe, he'd seen evidence of the future of sport climbing, a future he'd actually started to catch glimpses of a few years earlier while climbing largely alone at a scrappy area in Oregon, sometimes referred to as a mud pile called Smith Rock. He'd cleaned away some of the chossy rock and uncovered entirely new possibilities, futuristic possibilities. But the plight of the visionary, because they must break the rules and interrogate the reasons and push beyond our imaginations, can be a lonely one, full of uncertainty and internal struggle. They risk becoming a pariah for their radical, progressive attitudes. But when Alan returned home from Europe, he returned energized. He realized he wasn't alone at all. The greater climbing community had already gone where he imagined a path to be, and he'd seen the results. He'd seen and climbed on the routes that were being done overseas. Yosemite was no longer the standard bearer it had been in the previous decade. The U.S. was lagging behind, and he wanted to catch up. In his article, Eurotrends, he continues with a warning of sorts. "Not all U.S. climbers share the goal of catching up, but regardless, we'll all be affected by this revolution. Indeed, the future of our sport is being shaped by the driven individuals who pioneered these routes." What he didn't yet know was that all of those driven individuals had recently seen a photo taken by Heinz Zach on the cover of Mountain Magazine number 107. That photo, a perfect, clear blue sky with craggy peaks in the distance, framed by, in the foreground, a climber, pinching with both hands and both feet an impossibly steep and laser-cut, seemingly blank arete, ignited their imaginations. Many of the best climbers in Europe immediately booked round-trip tickets to fly to the U.S., to Redmond, Oregon. They wanted to climb that incredible arete for themselves and to meet that visionary climber. Alan Watts, who had barely an inkling that he had started a chain reaction that would indeed pull the U.S. from its anachronistic ethical sludge, sometimes screaming and kicking, into the new age of sport climbing. I'm Chris Hampton. You're listening to Written in Stone, Climbing's Most Important Ascents. This is Season 2, the 1980s.
1, 2.
While there's almost no doubt that early humans, probably the native Klamath people, ventured up the cliffs, the first climb in modern records at Smith Rock was done in 1935. And as it goes, as soon as one person breaches the gate, more are soon to follow. And at some point in the 1950s, a trio walked into Smith Rock with their hemp rope, hammers, and pitons, who couldn't possibly anticipate the impact they would have on the area. It was Jack Watts and Jerry Ramsey, who'd climbed several Cascade area volcanoes together, and Jerry's older brother, Jim. This trio climbed a lot of rotten rock, mostly interested in standing on the summits. But in 1961, Jim Ramsey would essentially introduce the idea of free climbing to the area with his ascent of a small pinnacle called All Rock via a Tennessee route that would have been amongst the hardest routes in the country at the time. But it wasn't anything they did while inside the park that would be their greatest contributions to climbing. Instead, that would happen a year before Jim climbed All Rock in the small Oregon town of Prineville. Jim Ramsey and Jack Watts had both come to Prineville because the town they lived in, Madras, didn't have a hospital, and their wives were in labor. On May 24th, 1960, both families would have new sons, born just a few hours apart. And in fact, the mothers would share a recovery room, and we have to imagine that Jim and Jack must have wondered, probably aloud, if young Bill Ramsey and Alan Watts would ever climb together. In the years to come, Jack Watts, who was more interested in the mountains of the Cascades, a place he would eventually gain a near encyclopedic knowledge of, would often take his family, including young Alan, along. But Alan grew more and more interested in rock climbing. And in their freshman year at Madras High, Alan and Bill fulfilled the wonder of their fathers, maybe their own destinies, and went climbing together. It didn't take long for Bill's gregarious nature and athletic prowess to start pushing Alan and his competitive nature toward trying ever harder climbs. A few years later, in 1978, the two of them both decided to go to the University of Oregon for mostly the same reason, a small cliff of columnar basalt known as Skinner Butte, or simply the Columns, that was nestled right in the heart of the town of Eugene. Now, any serious climber today might question this move and this reasoning, but at the time, crack climbing was the thing, and this tiny, slabby version of Devil's Tower was filled with cracks, and they could be climbing within 10 minutes of the end of class. And as it turns out, the move was absolutely the right one. Once in Eugene, the pair met climbers Chris Jones and Alan Lester. Where Ramsey had been an advocate for trying harder things, Chris Jones was a zealot. He'd been heavily influenced by John Gill and Pat Ament and connected with bouldering more than climbing on a rope. With his vision as a guide, the group would seek out and climb every possible eliminate and variation at the columns. They'd even go as far as creating their own scale based on the amount of contrivance required for each climb, from doing a line one-handed, C1, and all the way up to C5, getting more absurd along the way, but absolutely creating constraints that would make them much more adaptable climbers. Then, Setting the tone for what was to come, Chris Jones and Bill Ramsey would make the 3-hour drive to Smith Rock over several weekends, and using this skill they'd gained for hard, short sequences, make the first free ascent of the most famous feature in the park, the Monkey Face. Their route, Monkey Space, had been started by Bob McGowan and Jeff Thomas, but would require a tactic that just wasn't yet accepted. Most people at the time called it simply bouldering on lead, but in the mecca of climbing, Yosemite Valley, the ethical purists had a different name for it: hangdogging. Jones, being a boulderer, was more open to the tactic and spearheaded the Seminole Ascent, which combined the previous generation's lust for the summit with the future generation's obsession over difficulty. It used bolts, some reportedly placed on rappel, and would have been put off for a few more years had it not been for the willingness to bend the rules. Jones would later write to Pat Ament, "Two groups of climbers following different sets of rules, one set more strict than the other, with both groups competing for the same cliff resources, was clearly a recipe for the group with the strict rules to lose the competition." Leave it to a self-described boulder to help usher in the new age of sport climbing. But he wasn't wrong. I've got a confession to make. I've been climbing for nearly 30 years, and until a year ago, I'd never bought a piece of technical outdoor clothing. Maybe a raincoat 15 years ago and a puffy or two, but otherwise, nothing. But as I got back into sport climbing to try and finish 105.13s by my 50th birthday, I discovered that the cold winter winds of Wyoming that seemed to pick up force across the face of the crag and concentrate right on me were just too much for my usual hoodies. So I went shopping. And it takes a real event to force me to go shopping. I came home with a mid-layer that I thought I'd be able to climb in, but also might keep me from freezing up there, and I quickly discovered that the Rab Ascender light hoodie was long enough to fit easily under my harness, slim and stretchy enough to feel like it wasn't there, and had a hood that fit snugly enough on my head and neck that the wind didn't get in, and I didn't even notice the zipper. Since then, there hasn't been a single crag day that it wasn't with me. Now, I'm looking for other Rab layers that might make my experience even better. The Modulus hoodie and the Cirrus Flex insulated jacket, to be precise. And like I said, it takes a real event to make me go shopping. Rab. The mountains are our meeting place. With these hangdog tactics, no aid climbs were safe from the group of young rabble-rousers. They began systematically picking them off, and in the process, quickly raising the standards from the existing top grade of 11B. By early 1980, they'd pushed the highest grades at this small backwater in Oregon with less than desirable rock to 11D, with the aptly named Rising Expectations. Taking 3 days of effort with countless falls and more time than ever spent bouldering on lead, this route was as far as Chris Jones was willing to push the ethical boundaries. He left for the greener pastures and better rock to boulder on of Colorado. But the route left Alan Watts inspired. He saw what could be done if a climber was willing to spend time choreographing the moves, willing to put in the effort. It was around this time that he realized college wasn't for him, not just yet anyway, and besides, he'd all but climbed out the columns, so after the spring term of 1980, he quit school, leaving Eugene and moving back in with his parents in Madras, when he wasn't camping at Smith, that is. He was a climber, and he was going to focus on climbing. The next 2 years were spent almost entirely at Smith, finishing the remaining handful of 511s in the park, freeing what he could of the remaining aid routes, and dialing in how to climb on the volcanic tuff. Along with Alan Lester, he brought the first 512, Sunshine Dihedral, to Smith. Still a long way behind the standards seen elsewhere in the country. Remember, Yaniro had climbed Grand Illusion at 13B or C in 1979. But still, this was far beyond what was seen at Smith just a few years earlier. And they knew they could climb harder. But it soon became apparent that many of the aid routes that followed cracks would be just too painful and unpleasant to warrant free climbing, or just plain too hard for them. Looking across the cliffs, Watts thought it a shame that the burnt orange walls between the cracks were so blank. We'd have a paradise here if only there were holds on those walls, he thought. One day, while in an area known as the dihedrals, he noticed that if he squinted just right as the sun got to a certain spot high in the sky on a cloudless day, shadows would appear up one of those seemingly blank walls. He'd already freed some old aid routes in this zone, finding face holds where he didn't expect any to be, so his optimism that there might be something there didn't take long to hit max levels. But he had to know for sure what was up there. So on a partnerless day in June of 1982, he rapped down the face and was delighted to find small but positive holds. And the further down he went, the more holds appeared. It was definitely climbable, but there was absolutely nowhere to stop and place bolts on lead, as was the custom. He considered the line-blurring tactic John Backer had recently pioneered for his ascent of the Backer Yarian, climbing until he could hang from a hook on a protruding hold in order to drill a bolt. And Alan had experimented with this tactic, but the outward pull of a hook on these thin holds, combined with a hastily drilled and less safe bolt in this soft rock, seemed not worth it. Plus, the terrain just seemed too difficult. It wasn't nearly as featured as the knobby domes of Tuolumne, where Backer had made his statement. But sticking to the rules hadn't gotten him to where he was, so why start now? There were already, elsewhere in the park, a handful of bolts deemed necessary that had been placed on rappel. And well, these bolts on this blank face were, according to him, necessary. So Alan Watts started drilling. You care about your climbing, right? Of course you do. Then you owe it to yourself to provide the best options for improving. And when it comes to training equipment and boards, that means tension climbing. The Tension Board 2 isn't just a bunch of holds scattered randomly on a board. Those days are history. This board is intentionally designed to help you become a better climber faster by people who actually use the board every day. You owe it to yourself. There's just no substitute. Use the code WRITTEN15 at checkout for 15% off of select goods. TensionClimbing.com. Mastery over success. Last summer, after finishing season 1, the 1990s, an old memory popped into my head of looking in a library that had a bunch of old climbing magazines. That library was owned by Knowles, the National Outdoor Leadership School, which was founded in 1965 right here in Lander, Wyoming. My memory turned out to be correct, and now the bulk of my research is done in that library. And at first I snuck in, then I sweet-talked the ladies at the desk, and finally I reached out to Knowles to see if they would be interested in partnering up. And because they have an interest in history, as well as fostering a love for our wilderness and public lands, they agreed. Thank goodness. I'm just too old to be sneaking into libraries. Knowles, dedicated to developing leaders. In the winter of 1982, Alan's parents had come up with a plan. They wanted him to go back to school and would offer support if he would do so. His crew had all moved on, Alan Lester and Chris Jones to Colorado, and Bill Ramsey would soon leave for California to pursue his doctorate in philosophy. They knew Alan was driven and skilled, and they tried their best to persuade him to move on as well, to apply his climbing talents to better rock and to get entrenched into a deeper climbing community, but he wasn't budging. There was something about this place. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there it was, not quite dormant, but waiting there, quietly bubbling, just beneath the surface. He knew that it was there, and it was keeping him from leaving. And even if he'd wanted to, it would pull him back. Smith Rock was formed nearly 30 million years ago when a supervolcano erupted and deposited layers of ash and debris in a ring now known as the Crooked River Caldera. And while Jack Watts had spent considerable time at Smith, it was other Oregon volcanoes that drew his interest and introduced Alan to climbing. But as they say, like father, like son, so it was only fitting that Alan Watts would continue his climbing career on the remnants of not only a volcano, but one of the greatest volcanic explosions this continent has ever seen, one that would dramatically alter the surrounding landscape. So this time, when his parents offered, Alan knew he didn't want to go as far away as Eugene. That 3 hours was just too much. So in January of 1983, he moved to Bend, only about 30 minutes from Smith, to restart his education, or his conventional education anyway, at Central Oregon Community College. Once he was settled in and had gotten his class schedule dialed, his thoughts went back to that face he had bolted. With a light class load, he had more free time than he'd expected, so he began spending more and more time at Smith, trying the face, slowly piecing together the moves. A little further down the wall, just past the Sunshine Dihedral, there was a short, very steep arete that looked like it just might be impossible. And Alan had been wondering about it for a while now, and that potential impossibility cemented its place near the front of his mind. It just kept tugging him back to take another look. So after giving his usual once-a-day attempt on the bolted face, he decided it was time to rappel down the steep arete and satisfy his curiosity. He figured he'd settle the fact that it was impossible, or at the very least, destined for a future time. But to his surprise, there were holds. At the steepest parts of the wall, the biggest holds appeared. Far apart, sure, but they were there. It was as if Lau and Skell, the gods of the underworld and aboveworld, according to the Klamath people native to the area, had put aside their differences and conspired long enough to allow the eruption of this supervolcano in just the right way to create this overhanging volcanic tuff arete that someday some human would be able to climb. Alan couldn't believe it. But since there were no ethical police around to tell him that this rappel bolting and hangdogging was a step too far, and since progress at Smith Rock would stall out without someone taking that step, Alan Watts began drilling again. And there it was, now, rumbling beneath the surface, threatening to break through. With renewed spirit and motivation, Alan set to work. He did away with his usual routine of trying once a day and experimented with more attempts. These were the hardest things he'd ever tried, but he discovered that with some rest, he could give more attempts than he expected. And he was learning more and learning faster. The face climb was the first to allow his passage. It sensed that he was on the precipice of something bigger and gave up its secrets. Alan called it Watts Tots, and at 12B, it was among the hardest routes in the state and would eventually be heralded as the first sport route in the country. But for now, there wasn't much time to celebrate, because it was still there, growing louder and more impatient, ready to show itself, just like it had in Europe and Australia. Alan had no idea that a select group of other climbers spread out across the world had already landed in the same ethical stance that he was now firmly planted in. Bolts were being put in on rappel, rests were being taken by hanging on the rope, moves were being practiced repeatedly. And standards were rising. America was being left behind. But there it was, waiting for Alan. This arete, he was calling it corner number 1, was testing him on many levels. One move built on the next, which built on the next, which built on the next, and then finally resulted in an explosion over the steep lip to one of those surprisingly perfect buckets. And he just couldn't link all of those moves together. He'd fall, spend a little time looking for better beta, climb to the top, and then clean the draws off of the bolts so that he could rest, rack up, and try again. On one particularly big fall, he lowered to the ground and left the rope through the highest quick draw. And when he pulled back on, intending to just work some things out, he climbed to the top. But for him, it didn't feel like he'd done it. Despite the yo-yo ascent being accepted in the U.S., it wasn't what Alan wanted. He wasn't finished. He knew there was more to be done. There, just below the surface. See, a game is only a game if there are rules. The rules don't have to be the same for everyone, but they do define the experience of the person following them. Rules are mutable, but only to change the experience. And we adapt based on the constraints we're presented with, often created by those rules. Now, Alan was looking at the blank faces instead of the traditionally protected cracks. He was rappel bolting and hang-dogging. He was changing those rules. But he had immutable rules as well. He had to place the nuts and cams and quick draws on lead. They had to be removed between attempts. He had to climb it from the bottom to the top on lead. There were no other options. But the yo-yo showed him that he could do it. So he tied in again under corner number 1. And again, he came up short. But this time, just short. And he took another big fall. So far from the wall, in fact, that he couldn't get back in to remove the quick draws. And so he lowered off. The quick draws were hanging there, taunting him. What now? And there it was, eager to burst through to the surface. He rested, knowing he could do it, but not sure if today was the day. He'd have to get the draws down. Even if he had enough, it wouldn't count by his rules. But as he sat there, staring up at the steep arete, he came up with a compromise on his otherwise immutable rules. This, of course, is how it begins, and he came to this conclusion largely because it was now so close to the surface that it could barely contain itself. He pulled the rope and left the draws hanging. He steadied himself, not really aware of the pressure just below the crust, but being pushed up by it nonetheless. He pulled on. A series of good pockets led to the first clipping stance, but rather than clip the quick draw, he removed it from the bolt, hung it on his harness, and paused. He then removed it from his gear loop, hung it back on the bolt, and clipped the rope in. Satisfied with that effort, he repeated the task for the second bolt, and then calmly launched into the first crux. A long reach to the sharp arete, bumping his hand higher and higher, feet high to counter the barn door, and he was in it. Both hands pinching the arete, feet squeezing in opposition, one on each side of the sharp corner. At this precarious stance, perched on the corner, framed by the clear blue February sky, he removed, re-racked, removed again, and rehung the third draw. Clipped, moved up the arete, and made a hard lateral reach to a pocket, high step to a good foot, and copped a quick shake from a Gaston in the roof. And there it was, louder now, ready to be set free. He reached over the roof to an edge, repeated the process with the final quick draw, and set up for the big gymnastic throw to the God-sent bucket on the corner. It was already coming through the surface, free, roaring. Now, there was no stopping it. He set his feet. Where on previous attempts he'd been pumped and frantic, he was now calm, accepting of his position. Alan Watts, the accidental visionary, threw for the jug and stuck it, setting in motion an explosion. chain reaction that would not only reverberate throughout Smith Rock, but would reach across the world, bringing rock stars from every corner of the globe to establish many of the world's hardest routes, right here. A chain reaction that would dramatically and forever alter the landscape of climbing culture in America.
1, 2.
Written in Stone is produced by me, Chris Hampton, with help from Riley Rush for Plugtone Audio, a group of the best, most impactful podcasts in the outdoor industry. This week, our patrons, the Secret Stoners Club, are getting a reading of Alan's article from 1986, Euro Trends, as well as some of the other out-of-print resources for this story. And remember, this show is 100% rooted in the facts, but like Todd Skinner always said, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. If you love what you're hearing, give us those 5 stars and a glowing review. Join the Secret Stoners Club. It's free, and tell everyone you know at the crag, at the gym, in that internet forum where everyone is shouting into the void, and together we can tell the stories of climbing's most important ascents, one decade at a time. Secret Stoners. This episode was an absolute joy to put together. Getting to know Alan Watts a little bit over the last year, since last season of Written in Stone, has been really fantastic. I couldn't be happier that there are role models out there like Alan for the climbing community, especially for developers and any young climbers going to Smith because they know they have to prove themselves there. Alan Watts is inescapable if you go to Smith Rock, and I can't imagine a better role model. We've got a good start to this season. I'm feeling better and better about it. I'm finally feeling like I'm ahead a little bit. I've pretty much got December booked out, and I'm working into January now, which is a good feeling to not be finishing up an episode the day before it goes out. Also, like I mentioned in the very beginning of this episode, posters. I have one on my wall here. If you happen to follow me on YouTube, there's one right over my desk. It's a chain reaction, 40 years of sport climbing. It's a drawing of Alan on chain reaction of that famous Mountain Magazine cover photo that Heinz Zach took. That's been copied over and over and over. Interesting note. And maybe I'll do an episode eventually on some of the most famous and most copied photos in climbing history, but I went to the Knowles Library and went searching for this issue of Mountain Magazine. It's number 107, if you happen to want to look. And I found the issue with Alan on the cover. And I was flipping through the magazine, and I believe it's in the same issue. It might be in the next issue. I'll have to go back and check that to be sure. But there is an ad for Bial ropes with Jerry Moffat climbing chain reaction. It's nearly an exact copy of that same photo of Alan on chain reaction. And big in the ad, and I'll put these in the Patreon for you all to see, but big in the ad it says, "Our man Moffat on that route at that place." So one issue later, maybe not even one issue, I'm going to have to check on that. But at the very least, one issue later, it's already recognized enough that they can say, on that route at that place. That says so much to me. So cool. Anyway, those posters are on their way to me. As soon as I get them, I'm going to be giving away posters to Secret Stoners. So you all are already entered. You don't have to do anything to be entered. You're already there. Unless, of course, you're just here lurking and you're not actually a secret stoner, which you can do by joining the Patreon. It's free, or you can support us. We appreciate the support, but you can do that at patreon.com/Secret Stoners Club, or the link is right there in your show notes. I've got several giveaways coming this season from our sponsors, from some of the folks that we're talking to. I'm excited about these giveaways. Also, coming on Wednesday, bonus episode for you all. I'm reading Alan's article, Euro Trends, and giving my commentary. And I really like how this episode came out. I'm curious what you all think when you hear it, because I'd like to do more of these. I've been collecting the articles as I go, and the shorter, interesting articles, especially when it comes to things like ethics and grading and progression, I think are really fascinating. So I would love to read those and just sort of give some commentary as I go. Let me know what you think about that type of episode once you hear it. Next week, we're talking with the person who may be in the absolute best position for a number of reasons to tell us all about Alan Watts as a person, as a climber, and to walk us through those early days at Smith Rock. All right. I'll see you guys next week.